This is our presentation tonight. I am Jameer Sale. I'm representing tonight the Answer Coalition as well as the Amend the 13th movement to abolish slavery in America, as abolish legal slavery in America, as well as Sacramento Area Peace Action, of which I am a board member. So tonight we are going to be hearing a presentation in the context of Earth Day, which just passed this last week, and particularly talking about, if we are going to free the land, we are going to need to free the people. So talking about how the issues of environmental justice, environmental racism, as well as decolonization and ending the occupations, both in Palestine as well as here in the United States, we really are going to have to tackle this issue of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, and seeing how that's directly tied into the military industrial complex. So we're going to look at these two different struggles in context of each other tonight. And we're going to hear from an activist from the Answer Coalition, Stephen, who's going to be talking about this environmental struggle and Earth Day and militarism that comes along with the United States. And we're also going to be hearing from Sahar Francis, who's going to be coming directly to us from Palestine. And we're very fortunate to have them because it is currently 6 in the morning over there, whereas it's 8 o'clock at night for us. So although it's an inconvenient time for us, it's a little more inconvenient time for them. So we especially want to say thank you to them. But before that, we are going to hear a message from the Amend the 13th founder, Joka Hashima Jensai, who is going to explain to us a little bit more about the strategic release program that's currently active in California, trying to address the issue of political prisoners.
Greetings, sisters and brothers. My name is Joka Hashima Jensai, founder of Amend the 13th Abolish Legal Slavery in America movement and the Autonomous Infrastructure Mission. The struggle to end the oppression of man and woman by man and woman is not simply or even primarily based on our struggle against the hegemony of global capitalism or the fascist reformism of the U.S. corporatocracy and empire. No, these are external components of our struggle, and the resolution of our contradiction is first assessed internally. The Strategic Release Initiative was designed from the outset to address one of the core internal contradictions facing us as a liberation struggle globally, our crisis in leadership. The structural components of the Strategic Release Initiative, a proven record of service to our communities while in prison at least 25 years or more of continuous confinement, demonstrate through their work product and years of experience in social activism from the most repressive conditions existed in capitalist society that some of the greatest political, social, cultural, and economic minds of our time are members of the strategic release class. These imprisoned elders represent the most dedicated, most sincere, most ingenuitive, most courageous, and most needed leaders we have. It is for this reason that the Strategic Release Initiative is not simply another tactic in our collective arsenal to release our elders, but must be one of the central components of our abolitionist cause, period. To be sure, the most abiding structural component of the Strategic Release Initiative is the fact that those released under the Strategic Release Initiative must serve the community into perpetuity. This determination to give our lives to the people, to live our lives for the cause, ensures our elders will once again be present in our communities to cure this crisis in leadership which plagues us all. This is not to say that we do not have effective leaders present in many of our communities, because we do. However, we are faced with a set of social conditions where reformists outnumber genuine progressives, where so many of our people have and continue to be led down dead-end paths seeking liberation, only to find themselves shackled in new chains with different names, again and again and again. Broad-based support for the Strategic Release Initiative will find our communities demanding the release of our elders with the express purpose of bringing them home to take full advantage of their leadership and work product to improve all of our daily lives with solutions that strike at the roots of our oppression and human misery, as opposed to simply striking out ineffectually at its symptoms. Our struggle, like our suffering, is generational. It is incumbent upon each of us to make use of our greatest, most experienced, and most advanced weapons to wage this struggle, our imprisoned elders of the strategic release class. It is our sincerest hope that you join us in this historic struggle until we win or don't lose.
Again, those were words from Joka Ashima Jensai, founder of the Amend the 13th movement to abolish legal slavery in America. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to amendthe13th.org, and you can learn about the various initiatives of the Autonomous Infrastructure Mission. And so, yeah, so there will also be time at the end of all of these presentations for questions. So if you have a question, you can either write it in the chat or you can for later. But next up, we are going to hear from Stephen Sander. He's a representative of the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. And so I want to pass it on over to Steve.
Great. Thanks so much, Jameer. Good evening, everyone. And a revolutionary good morning to all the people tuning in from Palestine who might be watching our webinar today. California to Palestine, free the land, free the people. Thanks everybody for tuning in. As Jameer said, my name's Steve and I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Friends, comrades in the struggle, we're gathered in this virtual space to discuss how to free the land and free the Palestinian people who are being oppressed by this illegal Israeli occupation. And as we gather to celebrate Earth Day, I want to call attention to the environmental consequences that are causing the Palestinian people to suffer tremendously as a direct result of the Israeli occupation of the region. As an environmental scientist, let me say this as unequivocally as I can. The Palestinian people have played almost no role in contributing to the problem of human-induced climate change. It is the Western powers and the 100 biggest companies that have contributed almost exclusively to the problem of climate change. That means that Western powers have an obligation to protect countries like Palestine from the ill effects that climate change will cause in places like the West Bank and Gaza. And if the world is to get off of fossil fuels, then countries like Palestine need to be given the tools by already developed countries to grow their economy and their society in a carbon-free way. The fact that they have not done so and continue not to is something that causes me to feel a great sense of shame and anger. And it means that we need to call out these blatant injustices. They must be acknowledged, and that's why we're calling on the United States to remove its opposition to the International Criminal Court, looking into the human rights abuses perpetrated during the Gaza wars. So let me discuss some of these injustices, which are truly crimes against humanity and crimes against nature. And it is for this reason that we must have freedom for these people and for the land they're on. Freedom from this tyrannical oppression by these maniacs. They are necrophiles who actually want the Palestinian people to suffer. So we must free the land from occupation from this entity, and by freeing the land, we will free the people. And in order to free the land, we must free the people, and paradoxically, at the same time, we have to free the people to free the land, as you've heard from my colleague briefly. So indeed, as I transition to this next topic in my prepared remarks, I want to acknowledge the fact that I too occupy land that was stolen, and there has to be a process of accountability and reparations for that, for reparations for those whom this land was stolen, in this case, the Nisenan and Patwin indigenous people of the Americas. So I want to highlight a crucial aspect of this injustice taking place, and that is this apartheid state of Israel. It's a violation of human rights in so many ways. Israel continues to inflict environmental devastation in the occupied Palestinian territories. This has gone on for far too long, and it only seems to be getting worse. And make no mistake about it when I say apartheid. It is a two-tiered system of justice, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians and everybody else. So, as you might have heard just this week, Human Rights Watch released a report on the matter, and the conclusions they come to at this point are simply irrefutable. So, according to the report, quote, Israelis authorities maintain a two-tier system which privileges Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. This means used by Israelis in the occupied territory amount to the systematic oppression needed to establish the crime of apartheid. Israeli authorities have committed a range of abuses against Palestinians. In the occupied territory, those abuses include mass land confiscation, the denial of residency rights, and the suspension of civil rights, and rise to the threshold of inhumane acts and severe abuses of the fundamental rights of Palestinians, end quote. Additionally, The Nation magazine reports that Israeli apartheid policies extend even to the issue of COVID vaccines as well. So Yara M. Asi writes in a piece published this past Tuesday, quote, while Israel has vaccinated more than 60% of its population, giving it the highest COVID-19 vaccination rate in the world, and while it is slated to have millions of excess vaccines, it has refused to supply shots to most Palestinians in the occupied territories, with the exception of those with Israeli work permits. Just about 5% of the Palestinian population has been vaccinated despite skyrocketing infection and mortality rates. Israel has received global condemnation for its unwillingness to vaccinate the 5 million Palestinians living in the occupied territories. As the occupying power, it retains responsibility for Palestinian health. Even in the Oslo Accords, which do not supersede Israel's obligations, mandate that the two sides work together in cases of infectious disease, end quote. So Gaza Strip is indeed the world's largest open air prison, and Israel plays gatekeeper, preventing necessary supplies from entering and preventing people from coming and going as they wish. They prevent Palestinians from fishing in their own coastal waters. They prevent construction supplies and medical equipment from entering. They deny humanitarian assistance to the area even during a global pandemic. They have expressed nothing but ill intent towards the Palestinians living in that area, with Israeli leaders calling for them to be, quote, put on a diet, basically starved and deprived of resources until they acquiesce to Israel's demands. And the UN has said that Gaza would become unlivable by 2020, and it is only to the resilience of the Palestinian people that they continue to survive in these abhorrent conditions. You know, these apartheid policies are rooted in racism. As a person of Jewish descent, I could say that they are doing many of the same things that Nazi Germany did to the Jewish people. So we cannot allow this. We must not tolerate this kind of oppression and abuse to be perpetrated by an entity that we claim to be close allies with. And Nelson Mandela has called apartheid a crime against humanity. And in a speech to the UK House of Commons, Madiba noted, quote, racism is a blight on the human conscience. The idea that any people can be inferior to one another to the point where those who consider themselves superior define and treat the rest as subhuman denies the humanity even of those who elevate themselves to the status of gods. Indeed, racism is something that must be categorically rejected on its face whenever it appears. rejecting racism is something that must be foundational to a society that claims to treat everyone equally and with dignity and respect. And Professor Albert Memmi, in his seminal text Racism, writes, quote, "The choice to conduct oneself morally is the condition for the establishment of a human order for which racism is the very negation. One cannot found a moral order, let alone a legislative order, on racism, because racism signifies the exclusion of the other and his or her subjection to violence and domination. And the refusal of racism is the condition for all theoretical and practical morality, because in the end, the ethical choice commands the political choice. A just society must be a society accepted by all. If this contractual principle is not accepted, then only conflict, violence, and destruction will be our lot. If it is accepted, we can someday hope to live in peace," end quote. I'll go one step further. The famed Brazilian author and scholar activist Paulo Freire has written about the behavior of these individuals who oppress, and he appropriately labels it necrophilia, or the love of death. And Freire notes, quote, "Oppression, overwhelming control is necrophilic. It is nourished by love of death, not life. It attempts to control thinking and action, leads women and men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power." Is that not what Israel is doing at this moment? So at this point, is there any really substantial doubt that this is an apt characterization? So I would like to say a few words now about water and about olives, because these are two critically important areas that are under assault by Israel. First, I need to point out that olive groves in the occupied Palestinian territories are under assault from the dual threats of climate change and Israeli settlers. This is exacerbated by Israel's restriction and mismanagement of the water. Settlers are attacking Palestinian farmers who are just trying to access their land to harvest their olives and burning their trees. Settlers are bulldozing olive groves and doing things like building roads over them. However, the people are fighting back, and there have been several contingents of volunteers who come in every year, both from within Palestine and also from outside the country, who help the Palestinian people fend off attacks by the Israeli settlers and the various security forces, and try to put themselves between the assailants and those who are simply trying to harvest olives from their own lands and their own olive groves. And olive production is, of course, cyclical and variable over the years in the West Bank, but several climate change impacts have hindered production in recent years. For instance, last May, a heat wave damaged much of the olive production, and the average rainfall amounts have fallen, and the rainy season has been shortened in its overall duration. There will be several bouts of drought, followed by episodes of very intense rain, so it's not possible for the ground to soak it up all at once. And there are other consequences like flooding that could result from that. But it shouldn't take you the UN to tell you that the olive groves and these olive productions has a cultural significance for the Palestinian people, and it provides them with a much needed source of income. Research shows that olives have been cultivated as early as 8,000 years ago. However, for the tens of thousands of people who rely upon olives for their source of income, this is yet another abuse that they have had to suffer while under occupation. And the destruction of these olive groves is, in my view, an affront to humanity. So when it comes to the issue of water more broadly, it's estimated that 97% of the water in Gaza, unfortunately, is undrinkable. And according to research by Ibrahim Faris and Yasmin Mansour, quote, since the 67 occupation of the Palestinian territories, Israel has controlled shared water in the region, including both the surface and groundwater. Israel has been utilizing more than 85% of these resources, leaving only 15 for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Such control has deprived the Palestinian Authority of accessing an equitable and reasonable share of transboundary shared water and natural resources. The shortage of water and the Israeli restrictions on access to clean water are becoming more disastrous for the approximately 4 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, end quote. So it's imperative that all people have access to clean water as a human right, and that the water resources in the region be shared in an equitable manner with the Palestinian people. So, comrades and friends, with all this in mind, of course, it's natural to feel a bit discouraged, maybe, with all of the ways that the Palestinians are experiencing this oppression. However, I would like to offer some ways that you might be able to help in the struggle, and feel free to do one or none or all, however you feel, of course. First and foremost, I would say listen and signal boost the appeals of the Palestinian people themselves. Let us avoid speaking for them and instead use our power and our privilege to uplift their desires and their stories. Another example, support and engage in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or BDS, against Israel. Many of the tactics that were successful in overthrowing apartheid in South Africa could be employed successfully in this instance. Next, you can urge your congressional representatives to co-sponsor legislation that ends or scales back US support militarily for Israel. Don't continue voting for pro-Israel representatives who don't support your views simply because they're the lesser of two evils. At some point, they have to be shown that there are political ramifications for playing patty cakes with a state that supports and is upholding an apartheid system. You can support groups calling for the US to stop opposing the ICC from looking into war crimes committed during the 2014 Gaza war, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, get involved locally. Groups like the Answer Coalition, Sacramento Area Peace Action, the Strategic Release Campaign, the Sacramento Regional Committee for Palestinian Human Rights. Those are all examples of groups involved here in Sacramento, where I'm speaking to you from. So with all of that in mind, comrades and friends, thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much for your attention to this, this really critically important issue. We have to draw this nexus, and we must free the land and free the people if we are to create a sustainable future for all. We say, attack one of us, you attack us all. So we need to be involved in the fight back. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Jameer.
Thank you very much, Steve. And now I will introduce Adib Al-Zanoun. He's the current chair for the Sacramento Regional Coalition for Palestinian Human Rights. And so I want to pass it over to Adib, and he will announce our next guest.
Thank you, Jameer. I got a note before I start that somebody's in the waiting room trying to get in the meeting. Got it?
Okay, I'm in.
Jameer? Okay, good.
Yeah, they're in now.
Okay. I lost my view. Here we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know it's a little bit difficult, even here in the month of Ramadan. 8 o'clock our time is probably people just had something to put in their mouth because the sun sets at 7:50. So, but thank you, everyone who made it. Um, our guest speaker is from Ramallah. Mrs. Sahar Francis has been the General Director of Ramallah-based Ad-Damir since 2006. Ad-Damir is a prisoner support and human rights association. It is a Palestinian non-governmental organization. We call them NGOs, providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israel and Palestinian prisons. Ms. Francis is an attorney by training. She joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer, then as head of the legal unit. With over 20 years of human rights experience, including human rights counseling and representation, Mrs. Francis also was on the board of Defense for Children International, Palestine section, for 4 years. Please help me welcome Ms. Sahar Francis. It's all yours.
Thanks, Adib, and good evening for everyone, and thanks to include me in this meeting today. I think it's in Palestine, and to make this is there a problem in the...
No, you're good to go.
Okay. I think it's very essential and important to make these connections between what's going on in Palestine, in all Palestine. As Steve mentioned, the report that was issued by Human Rights Watch this week is a very important report that talks about the apartheid policy, not just in the occupied territories 67 in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, but in the whole Palestinian territory of 1948, as well inside Israel, there is systematic apartheid policies. And I will describe some examples of these policies that were taking place actually since 1948, after the colonization of Palestine and uprooting more than 400 villages, Palestinian communities that were living in what became to be known as the State of Israel later. But it wasn't stopped in 48 by controlling the land. Actually, they continued with the policies of making the Palestinians staying in the less land that they can and controlling the majority of the land in Palestine and actually controlling the people as well. You should know that immediately after, actually in 1950s, Israel implemented military control over the Palestinian community who stayed inside the state and became citizens of the state. They lived under a military regime up to 1966, 1 year before the occupation of the rest of Palestine. Israel controlled the Palestinian community by the military rules, military orders. You needed a special permit to travel inside your own country from one village to another. You needed special permits to work in certain jobs and so on. And in 1967, when they occupied the rest of the territory, most of the policies that they were implemented in 48 areas, they were moved to be used in the occupied territories, like the military orders that they started to implement in the occupied territories the military courts that they started to use in the occupied territories, the policies of land confiscation, house demolition, arrests, and so on. So I think it's totally true, this slogan that we need to free the land in order to free the people. It's totally connected, and we should keep in mind the endless support, the unconditional support that the United States is offering for the Israeli side in all of the levels, not just on the economical level, but definitely on the diplomatic level in the international arena, especially when it comes for the UN system and all our all the efforts that the Palestinians with the allies and with the supporters in order to seek accountability via the special procedures in the UN or in the Security Council, or lately in the ICC. All these steps, of course, would be blocked always by the United States and the position that it's not applicable to Israel. Even the report, they already issued a position about the report of Human Rights Watch that apartheid is not the correct legal term to be used in the context of Israel. Actually, I would highlight more the policy of house demolitions and how it was used inside Israel in order and planning policies and controlling the land in order actually to control the Palestinians living inside the country. All these decades, Israel was issuing laws in order to control the ability of the Palestinians to expand their villages who remained after the 48 war. And no one single new Palestinian village or a town was established inside the state of Israel after 48, the opposite. And I would highlight just one example of the latest years. This was a very famous case that Adala Center, the Arab Minority Rights Inside Israel Center, dealt with in front of the High Court inside Israel for more than 1 decade, fighting to keep the people of al-Hiran, a Bedouin village in the South Desert, in their place, because the state decided to evacuate the village, to kick out the Palestinian people and to establish an Israeli settlement under the same name, Kibbutz Hiran. And the suggestion was from the Bedouin community that we can share it. We can, like there are 1,000 people, more or less, why you don't keep us in our land? And we don't mind if you want to use part of the land to establish an Israeli village or so. And the High Court refused. And maybe you remember when the police raided this village and they killed Abu al-Qi'an, the teacher, and they claimed that he tried to drive over the police who was in the place. Later, it was a lie. And the facts proved that they shooted him and he lost control on the car, and they refused to allow any ambulance or any help to be offered, and he died very soon after he was shot. So this is still happening today. It happened like 3-4 years ago, and by illegal confirmation from the highest Israeli court, the Israeli High Court, actually. So how we can struggle against such policies if it's not just coming from the government, from the ministries, from the executive power, but it's also supported and justified by legal means, by the justice system inside Israel. This is totally the apartheid. And there's hundreds of examples about other policies, whether in the education, in the health system. It's not just about the housing and the land and the planning. It enters in every aspect of our daily life. Even scholarships in the universities, there is discrimination based on the fact that if you serve in the army, and they are aware that Palestinian Arabs mostly don't serve in the army, so we are not getting the same scholarship in the same procedures as the Israelis who serve in the army. So these policies of land control via the confiscation and the house demolition policies, or the uprooting of olive trees or other lands, the control of the land continued after the occupation of the rest of Palestine in 67, and expansion of settlements is still taking place, although they are aware that one of the essential cases maybe for the International Criminal Court prosecution office would be investigated and dealt in this process is the settlement, but they don't care, because all these years the main problem was that they were never accountable. They had the feeling that they are above the law, they can violate international law on daily basis without any accountability. They can run with it easily and continue with their project without any accountability. And this is what's going on the ground with this silence of the international society, not just the United States. I would blame as well Europe in this place, where actually we can blame all the countries that at least they signed the Fourth Geneva Convention, where they have a clear duty to end the occupation and not to support the occupation, not to make the occupation lives for more than 5 decades. So house demolitions are taking place on daily basis in the occupied territories, especially in East Jerusalem. They're enforcing people to demolish their own houses because they claim it was built illegally. In the same time, they're not offering the proper planning in order to enable Palestinians to guarantee this special permit to build your house in some areas. They're confiscating agriculture land, and definitely the issue of the land becomes more complicated after the building of the separation wall and the annexation wall. The wall wasn't about security. The Israeli propaganda is that we needed to establish this wall in order to protect ourselves from the Palestinian attacks, but it wasn't true, because taking the reality about where the wall is passing, how the wall is built, what the wall is aiming to control, actually, it's all about controlling the land, controlling the water resources, Stephen, that you were describing, and to make the Palestinian life is intolerable. Like imagine people locked in their village and they need to enter via an electronic gate every morning to go out, whether to work, to get treatment, to get their education, and so on. And they're not allowed to come back unless if they can prove that they live inside this village, because this village is surrounded by the wall and gates and so on. Tens of Palestinian villages are suffering from such situation. This is brings me to the actually controlling the land without controlling the people. It will not work perfectly. So the imprisonment and the mass incarceration policies that was always like also in 48 areas in the early years of the establishment of the state, thousands of Palestinians were arrested and imprisoned, whether under clear security claims that they were involved with the Palestinians who fled outside the country in militant attack, or under arbitrary detention, administrative detention, or for their political affiliation. The same policy were used inside, like in the occupied territories after 67, with the same theory of the security that can justify everything. So security, like the British security regulations that the British mandate imposed on Palestine in 1945 were used inside Israel and later on in the occupied territories. They are still in use, by the way. They were amended in different ways, but this is still the base for the use of administrative detention for the crime of being a member in political party, because all of the political parties in Palestine, by the way, including the PLO, the whole Palestinian political organization that represents the majority of the political life in Palestine, is still declared illegal according to the military orders. So theoretically, they can arrest any political leader, including the president, Mr. Abbas himself, as being the head of Fatah and the head of the PLO. Of course, the use of the mass incarceration was the most powerful tool for the occupation to control the people in Palestine all these decades. Currently, there's around 4,500 Palestinian political prisoners inside the Israeli prisons. This includes 140 children, 40 women in detention, and around 440 administrative detainees. Administrative detention is arresting people without any charge, without any clear accusation, based on secret information, claiming that you are a threat to the security, and it could be renewed indefinitely. Hundreds of human rights defenders, activists, journalists, were arrested. In the last year, there is a systematic attack on students. Like tens of students from different Palestinian universities were arrested in the last year and facing trial based on the claim that they are active in illegal organizations, because also all the studential movements in Palestine are declared illegal because Israel claims that it's associated with the political parties. The Palestinian prisoners were suffering a lot in the last year because of the COVID complications. All family visits were totally canceled immediately with it was one of the first restrictions imposed with the coronavirus measures that the state took, because all of the prisoners are held in prisons inside Israel, except just one prison, Ofer prison, that is located near Ramallah, but they still request the families to seek a special security permit in order to reach Ofer. So they totally canceled family visits. Family visits were renewed for several very short period over the summer, the last summer in August and September, to be restricted again in October, November, till today, actually blaming that the Palestinian Authority didn't get vaccine and most of the population here didn't get the vaccine. So Israeli prison authority are not allowing anyone to enter if he cannot prove that he has the green passport. Of course, while they are not getting family visits, Palestinian prisoners have no right to public phones in their sections, in the security sections they are held inside the Israeli prison, which means some of them, they are totally disconnected for more than 1 year now from their families because they are not able to contact them. And as a privilege, because Palestinians and Israeli human rights organizations lately, we were petitioning the High Court on this issue of the visitation, and the prison system came and said, because of the Ramadan, we will allow each prisoner one phone call, like to contact his family, to greet them for the Ramadan, and that's all. And it was for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Of course, the health conditions is a very problematic issue lately in the last 3 years, more than 5 detainees lost their life inside the Israeli prisons out of health neglect. And of course, there's still the policy of holding the bodies. You know, when someone dies inside the prison, mostly Israel refused to return the body to the family. There's 8 bodies of prisoners held till now with the Israeli side. The education is very problematic. There's lots of details. I don't think we will end up speaking about every aspect of the daily violations that the Palestinian prisoners face under the system. But it's very, very important to highlight how Israel actually affects and controls all of our life, not just by criminalizing every aspect of our activities, like being a member in student activity is student movement is a crime, but also interfering in our daily political life. Correct that we were planning to have the election very soon. They started with arresting candidates or active that they were aware that these people would be involved in the process of the election. In the last 2-3 weeks, some people from different political parties were targeted because of the election. This has also happened back in 2006, in the election of 2006. In 2005, 3 months before the election, Israel arrested 450 activists from the field that they were sent mostly for administrative detention. And by this, they were hoping to affect the Palestinian election. They arrested more than 48 parliamentarians in 2007 after the election. And by this, they totally paralyzed the Palestinian parliament since then. So actually, they can use the law via military orders to keep this control over the land, over the people, over the sea in Gaza, over the borders in the whole occupied territories. And this is why I would join Steve with his call that we should take actions. We cannot just wait till the decision-making level in the different countries change their minds and allow Palestinians to seek justice via the ICC or the international other bodies in the UN system. But we have the tools like the PDS, the boycott, divestment, sanction was a very successful campaign and it's effective. One example about how it could be effective, the campaign that we launched with the other supporters against G4S, the security company, a couple of years ago, it enforced the company to pull out from the Israeli prison system industry where they had contracts with the Israeli system, and they pulled out. So this shows that we can make difference by joining efforts, by really educating people more and more about these similarities, the same oppression tools, the same techniques they use in demonstrations in the United States to oppress demonstrators claiming their freedom and their rights, they are used in Israel. The same techniques of torture that Israel is using, exporting to the other countries in order to oppress their prisoners and their detainees. Lots of joint policies are developed on the level of security and the control over the people by security measures. The Israelis are masters in the security, like the new techniques in the new technology developments, and they're selling their equipments and their programs everywhere. So I think this is why boycotting these companies and these entities that involved in violations of human rights, not just in Palestine, And this is the powerful point, that it's similar and joint everywhere. If we joint effort, we can make difference. Thanks a lot, and sorry for being a bit longer.
Thank you very much, Sahar. And now we want to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to either type it into the chat here, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. I know I had a question, which was, I know you mentioned about BDS, and here in the United States, we've dealt with BDS both in regards to the Palestinian movement in order to boycott the Israeli products. And then there have been activists who kind of borrowed this tactic in regards to mass incarceration and targeted companies that are invested in the prison industrial complex. And I know that Victoria's Secret and AT&T are two companies that are both invested in the prison industrial complex and have considerable investments in the occupied territories, and also actually in some of the illegal settlements there. And so could you tell us maybe about some of the other companies that people should be aware of that are particularly egregious in regards to doing business with Israel and the illegal settlements?
Actually, it's very important to highlight that last year, the UN Human Rights Council published a whole list of, what it's called the blacklist, actually, that includes more than 100 international companies that considered to be benefiting from the Israeli occupation. So every company listed in this list, I'm sorry, I can't remember most of the names there, but it's easy to reach it. It's published in the Human Rights Council, and I'm sure that you can find in the PDS website a link to the blacklist, or at least in Al Haq organization website as well. You can, because they were working a lot on to reach this point where the UN published such a blacklist in relation to the Palestinian occupied territories. So, but I mean, Elbit, there is a campaign about Elbit and, you know, the computer company HP and so on. So several companies that they are involved in the industry of the occupation are listed there.
Thank you for that. And then in the comments here, it says, have there been any specific gains made in the area of children being profiled and imprisoned, brutalized, and killed?
Thanks for this question. This is maybe would bring me as well to highlight the campaign in the United States from our colleagues, Defense for Children, No Way to Treat a Child, and the law that was initiated by the Congresswoman McCollum. It's for long, like I think for more than 4 or 5 years now, they're trying to gain support and raise awareness by this initiative to stop the United States on the level of the support to the Israeli army, to guarantee that none of this support, the financial support, are invested in violating children's rights while they are facing imprisonment. Unfortunately, all the pressure and the issue of the child detainees usually is getting more attention than the usual prisoners' issues, because of the sensitivity of being a child facing all these torture and ill treatment under a military regime. But still, this didn't cause Israel to stop the policy. They were improving some of the regulations or the measures they take, but It never stopped torture totally. It never stopped arresting children over midnight, harassing them, harassing the whole family, and sending them for long sentences. Although the number now is limited for 140, but there's 2 children under administrative detention. One of them is Amal Nakhli, a very important case to highlight. This child suffers from a very complicated disease on his nerve system that causes him, if he's infected with any virus, he may lose his life. And he was arrested last November, irrelevant to the situation of the COVID and the spread of the COVID in the prisons. And he had also a cancer in his lung. He got surgery, he's better now, but lots of health complications, and still he was held under administrative detention and secret file. Although last year he was charged with throwing stones, and we managed to release him on bail from the charge sheet. So 2 months after the court released him on bail, they came and arrested him under administrative detention. If they are able to deal with a child in this way, which kind of protection we can offer for those children, unfortunately. And this is why it's really very, very, very important to be aware about what's going on the campaign in the United States level on the child detainees. And I'm sure you can find much more information via the website and the campaign of No Way to Treat a Child run by DCI. I would highly recommend to look into the campaign and to try to join it and to see how you can support it.
And I would just say as well that, you know, when you want to talk about no way to treat a child, it's no way to treat a child, you know, to shoot them. If you recall the 2018, you know, Great March of Return, these Israeli soldiers from, you know, several hundred meters away, you know, they're maiming children who are participating, you know, in this demonstration and this march of return on the separation barrier. And you know, there's evidence, of course, that they are intentionally, you know, shooting these children in, you know, in the head and intentionally maiming them in a very cruel, heartless manner with the, you know, these high-powered rifles, and the children are, you know, in many cases not even armed, you know, no threat to the soldiers whatsoever. So there have to be, you know, political consequences for those cowardly acts. I mean, if, for instance, last summer, the United States experienced a you know, kind of uprising against racism with the George Floyd protesting, Breonna Taylor, all of those names. You know, imagine if the police just shot to kill, you know, all of these people, you know, so that we would never stand for that. And it would be an explosion, you know, of insurrection against, you know, a tyrannical regime. So I think that it calls for the same level of concern, if not greater concern, because you know, for the simple fact they're children, they're for the most part unarmed, you know, cowardly, several hundred meters away, you know, they're being maimed, and for the rest of their lives they will have to live with these consequences, you know. It's just not right.
You know, the number maybe got much less of targeting children and killing them, but the policy was never abolished. It's still there. The problem is in Israel is mostly related as well with the orders for the soldiers or the police, how easy they can shoot. This is a very serious problem, and this is what caused all this mass fatalities in the return marches in 2018 and later. And it's the same policy till today, whether there's a demonstration on Fridays against the wall or in any clashes. It's very easy for them to shoot to kill because they never limit themselves to shooting on lower part of the body. It's mostly in the chest and the head.
Yeah, and I would just add for anyone living in the United States right now and paying attention to the news, this is the exact thing that we refer to as police terror. So again, to see the parallels is not really surprising, especially considering the vast military aid, military training that goes both ways, not just the US training Israeli forces, but also Israelis training our US military and police. So it's really unfortunate that we see the effects in both places in such a parallel way. We still have a little bit of time here if folks have more questions or comments.
I had a question. This is Chris.
Sure.
Yeah, and I put it in the chat, but you didn't see it. It was on the imprisonment of the lawmakers, the PLC lawmakers. Do any of them remain in jail, Sahar, to this day?
Yes, of course. There's still 8 of them jailed. One of them, Marwan Barghouti, that he's still imprisoned. Right. And actually, there is 3 that they are sentenced, and the others are under administrative detention. Some of those PLC members were in and out since 2007, for more than 10 years under administrative detention.
Thank you.
One question I had in regards to supporting prisoners who are targeted by the occupation forces, is there a difference in approach between for instance, when there are lawmakers or activists kind of targeted for their political activity versus when you have, for instance, a youth who's throwing stones? Is there a difference in the approach of how they're supported after they've been targeted for incarceration?
You mean supported by us as a legal organization, or?
Yeah, as an organization, but also kind of as the movement, and the people, overall.
So for us as human rights organizations, Damir and all the other Palestinian NGOs, no, we represent and we offer the same service for everyone. Even if he's involved in more serious activities and he would be tortured, ill-treated, or she, of course. So it's the same legal representation that we offer. From the Palestinian community treats all prisoners more or less the same. The whole issue of prisoners sometimes gets more attention than other times. It's related to the difficult situation on the ground when there's more other hot issues. For example, these demonstrations in Gaza and the shootings and the killings, it would take the attention more than the prisoners' case. But on the international level, I would say, yes, sometimes we feel there's more attention for the children. I'm not judging, of course, I totally understand that some cases would be more easy to follow and more easy to campaign for and to demand the release. When you're talking about a human rights defender, a very well-known Palestinian human rights defender like Isa Amr or Khitam Saafin, now the Palestinian feminist, the director of the Union women committees that she's under administrative detention, it's a bit different. People can associate in the international level maybe more to such cases than all the 140 children that they are imprisoned, that some of them, they are involved in throwing stones or so. But this is why we try to bring all the different levels of violations in order to highlight not just the individuals, but I mean the policy, administrative detention, attacking human rights defenders, attacking journalists, attacking political leaders, and so on.
And that brings me to one last question, which is if you could maybe highlight the policy of collective punishment that's often used against Palestinians, particularly against people's families, and just, pretty much anyone can become the target of, and kind of talk about that, because that's something where I would say in the United States, we don't have to deal with that, or similarly, the home demolitions. So those are kind of more extreme forms of the occupation. So if you could maybe kind of shed some light on that for us.
Of course, collective punishment is always used by the occupation. So for example, if there's a militant attack comes implemented by one person from one village, and they will kill him. In most of the cases, they end up shooting the person. So it will not be the end of the story. They will demolish the house of his family, irrelevant if the family was aware about his planning or not. They can put the whole village under curfew for a couple of weeks, doing night searches, arresting other people from the same village, interrogating them. These searches would include lots of violence inside the houses, where they can break furniture and cause injury in some cases, where they use, for example, dogs, and dogs could attack people inside these houses. Collective punishment of house demolitions is very often used, especially in any activity that ends up with injury or killing an Israeli. When you put a whole village under curfew, or you claim that you close the village, like in the relation with the wall and all these policies of putting gates around the entry of the village, or this is a collective punishment at the end of the day for the whole community living in this. So it comes in different ways. When you hold the body of someone, it's a collective punishment for the family. Why, if someone dies inside the prison, his family should be punished without being able to bury him in dignity? Like, this is a punishment for the whole family. The person died, that's it. How you could it's not a punishment. Holding the bodies is not a punishment against the person himself. It's exactly a punishment against the whole family, whether you are a prisoner or you were killed outside. So, I mean, it's still used in very different ways.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there any more questions from folks or comments before we wrap it up?
Just really quick on that issue of collective punishment. Israel claims to be a democracy and to respect democratic control, yet we saw that when, for instance, they had elections and that, Hamas came to power, how did they respond? They became much more aggressive in the stance. They kind of locked things down, pushed ahead with annexation and cut off diplomatic talks and started, this campaign increasingly of, raids and attacks, basically breaking down further the peace process simply because they voted for, the Palestinian people voted for somebody that Israel didn't like. And that is, to me, that's starkly strikes as collective, punishment over a democratic election.
Indeed, indeed. All right. So if we do not have any final questions or comments, I would like to offer the last word to you, Sahar, if you have anything, any final words you'd like to give, or particularly any websites or actions. I know you mentioned, of course, BDS movement. Everyone should be encouraged to check that out. But yeah, anything else you'd like to let us know before we close it out?
I would really thank you, and it's really much appreciated. I think we should really develop more and more these kinds of sharing information and discussions and learning from each other how we can fight the oppression that we are facing, because there's lots of similarities. They are joining efforts as oppressors, and this is why we should join efforts. So I'm really delighted to join you today, that you gave me this opportunity, and let's hope that we keep the joint work together for the future. And good luck in every campaign or work that you do.
Thank you very much. And with that, we are going to close it out. And I encourage everybody to check out adamir.org, as well as amendthe13th.org, sacpeace.org, answercoalition.org, and stay in touch with the work that all these different groups are doing. So thank everybody. Have a great night. And to Sahar, have a great day.
Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.